There was a time when Tomb Raider stood as one of the most recognizable game series in the world, yet decades removed from those core design originals, the classic series feels more like a distant echo. Yet the magic remains, that sense of isolation as you make your way through Tomb Raider's labyrinthian worlds. It recalls a time when the simple act of exploring a 3D space required dexterity and patience, which is where Tomb Raider 1 through 3 Remastered comes into play. Released as a single package, this brand new collection boasts updated versions of the first 3 Tomb Raider games, boasting enhanced lighting, improved detail, higher resolution textures, and much smoother performance. This new release feels both fresh yet retro at the same time. And over the last week, I've been playing these 3 games while stacking them up against the original versions. How does it look in action? How do the controls feel in 2024? Are the new analog controls beginner friendly? All this and more shall be answered as we dive back into the world of Tomb Raider. In 2016, I created an episode of DF Retro covering the original Tomb Raider, where I compared the game on PlayStation, Saturn, and PC, while also showcasing some of the underlying technology in action, such as Sega Saturn's unique sprite-driven 3D rendering. Since that video, however, the original Tomb Raider has continued to thrive, primarily due to the open-source Tomb Raider engine known as Lara, which has released and continued to thrive, not only showcasing impressive new visual features, but also enabling the community to go wild with porting. As a result, there now exists versions of Tomb Raider on systems such as the Sega 32X, the 3DO, and even the Game Boy Advance. Yet the last original installment in the series released back in 2018, so it's been 6 years. A new Tomb Raider is said to be in the works, but thankfully as we await a new installment, we have a brand new re-release with the first 3 games thanks to Aspyr. And save for a few minor issues here and there, my experience has been excellent, and I'd like to talk about it. The pitch is pretty simple, really. This release seeks to deliver the first 3 games in the Tomb Raider franchise with a range of optional enhancements. You can now play these games with improved graphics, or stick with the original assets. You can also choose to play with those original tank controls, or opt for a more modern full analog system. The big selling point here really are these visual enhancements, and frankly, I think they've done a fantastic job. In order to retain the original design of Tomb Raider, however, the environments in this remastered version stick to the original geometry and layouts, but everything surrounding it has been updated. The first thing you might notice are the brand new high-resolution textures applied across the games. And thankfully, the game itself provides an interesting tool for comparing these original textures to the brand new ones created for this remastered edition, and that is the option to toggle between enhanced and original graphics. By toggling this in real time, we can see the change happen before our eyes. And I like what they've done here. The textures strive to resemble the original artwork, but they layer in a tremendous amount of additional detail along the way. These remastered textures really channel the original aesthetic beautifully, not to mention the color and tone. It's kind of an acquired taste, I suppose, but I think it's an interesting design. It kind of resembles a lost early 2000s PC game, thanks to relying on that original level geometry, which is key to the gameplay, by the way. It reminds me of installing the S3TC texture pack for Unreal Tournament in a sense, where you apply these ultra-fine detailed textures to rather simplistic surfaces. They've also made changes to things like animated textures. The water, for instance, has been replaced with a new surface texture that I think looks pretty good, significantly better than the old one anyways. It's not on par with the rippling water and interactive caustics available in Open Lara, unfortunately, but it perhaps gels better with the game's overall visual style. Overall, I do feel they've done a good job with the texture work in this version, but there was some discussion around whether or not AI upscaling was deployed here, and we've seen things like this in the past with similar remasters. I'm not really an expert in this area, however, but the key here is that most of the telltale signs you expect from AI upscaling are at least minimized to non-existent, so the end result feels pretty good, as if it were carefully adjusted by hand. The textures do look very crisp. This is not like the GTA Remastered collection, for instance, where obvious issues with upscaling appeared all over the place. Most of the textures here look really sharp and clean, managing to avoid the smudging and weirdness you often get with AI upscaling. They also deployed some rather curious tricks, like this attempt at faking depth on ladders using parallax effects. Yeah, it can look a little weird sometimes, but it's a neat addition. Now, beyond the textures themselves, the team also layered in additional 3D assets. The original games mostly relied on sprites or very low polygon scenery assets, but here they've upgraded this significantly, adding things such as grass blades where there previously were none. It's done just tastefully enough so as not to overwhelm the visual design, but I do think it greatly improves the presentation, especially in areas like this. They even went so far as to create high-resolution versions of the game's various menus and video clips. These original videos have seemingly been AI upscaled, and they look good enough, I suppose, but there's really only so much you can do given the low resolution of those original movies. But what I really love are the menus. Firstly, they do include the option to toggle the graphics at any point, including on the menus, which gives you a nice high-res version of the artwork. However, what I especially adore is the fact that they've recreated the main menus for each of the 3 games. That includes the music, sound effects, and visuals. By pressing up and down, you can cycle between them, which is a really cool touch. Then there's the lighting. The original Tomb Raider uses a mix of static lighting and per vertex lighting for dynamic objects. And in 1996, it was a fast solution that produces a nice sense of light and darkness, basically contrast within the tombs themselves. But obviously, it has pretty serious limitations. With Remastered, however, the developers seem to have implemented increasingly modern, baked lighting into the levels, while perhaps using some sort of light probe system to allow contributions to dynamic objects as well. As a result, the game not only more accurately portrays light and shadow, but you also get some color transfer. For instance, if you enter a room with predominantly red features, you'll notice a soft reddish glow on characters and the rest of the environment. We're not looking at any sort of fancy ray tracing effects here or anything, but this new passive light looks really good, and it fills the world with far more natural lighting that actually plays nicely with its simple geometric shapes. The only caveat, though, is that in some cases, areas that were overly and unrealistically lit in the original game now appear darker due to the behavior of light. The problem is that this can make it more difficult to navigate these sections or find objects you might need to complete the level. I didn't personally struggle with this myself, but new players might. At least in the larger areas, the draw distance has been expanded, so the black fog that often filled many levels has been completely eliminated. You can see much further away. The other major overhaul then involves the characters themselves, which all feature more detailed models that are reminiscent of the first round of Crystal Dynamics developed Tomb Raider games. Even better, the real-time cutscenes now feature actual facial animation used to match the dialogue, which is something that was not true of the original versions, where they simply used bobbing heads instead. So while these visual upgrades may not appeal to everyone, I think it strikes a nice balance between retro and modern that is very much appreciated. It feels fresh revisiting these levels in 2024, but it still feels like Tomb Raider. Perhaps most crucially, level readability, aside from the occasional light issue, remains high, which is key to the central gameplay of Tomb Raider. Now, you may have noticed that I've been using comparisons from different versions of Tomb Raider throughout this video, which does raise some interesting questions. You see, the classic graphics mode, which seems suitably retro at first, is more of an idealized version of Tomb Raider rather than an accurate reproduction. For instance, this is the original Tomb Raider running in DOS using software mode with an 8-bit color palette. There's lots of visible banding as a result, not to mention texture warping and other issues. This is running on original hardware, by the way, fed through a RetroTink 4K. While it shares the same basic assets, it winds up looking very different than the classic graphics mode seen in Remastered. If we bring in the 3D accelerated versions, things look even more different. Here we're looking at the game running on a real 3DFX Voodoo graphics card in DOS on a Pentium 3 based PC, which admittedly is more powerful than PCs of 1996. The key here is that it looks very different from the classic graphics mode available in the remastered version. Not only do you get texture filtering, But there's also this beautiful edge AA that cleans up aliasing along geometric edges, not to mention some other visual features such as mip maps. It looked really great on a 3D FX card back in 1996, and part of that was due to the frame rate, because even on a lower end CPU you could get to a stable 30 frames per second, at least mostly. But from a modern perspective, I kind of prefer the pixelated textures we see in the classic graphics mode. When Tomb Raider 2 and 3 made their way to the PC, however, they shifted towards using Windows 95, but they do retain all the typical 3D acceleration features you might expect from that era. Now, if we bring in the PlayStation version, you get a higher color depth and colors that more closely match the newer classic mode in the remastered version, but you also have to deal with things like increased texture warping and a reduced draw distance, not to mention dithering. Which is why I feel the classic graphics mode seen in Tomb Raider Remastered represents a nice middle ground of sorts. It preserves those original assets, but it allows high resolution rendering and increased color depth without using texture filtering or suffering from texture warping. Now then, where can you play this new version, you might be asking? Tomb Raider Remastered is available on basically every current and last generation console. For this video, I tested the game on Xbox Series X, Series S, PS5, PC, Steam Deck, and Switch, but it also runs on Xbox One and the PS4. I did not feel the need to test every single version, however, because frankly, this is one of those releases where I feel you can extrapolate the results from other consoles and determine that everyone will have a solid experience. What do I mean by that? Well, let's consider the weakest system, Nintendo Switch. This one delivers either 1080p native at 60 FPS in docked mode or 720p 60 in portable. It maxes out the system's display options basically, and it does so without breaking a sweat. In every situation, I did not encounter even a single frame rate hiccup. Mind you, there's always a possibility of a dip somewhere way later in the game, but even if that's the case, I'd argue we're looking at a near perfect experience. The more powerful consoles, however, such as Xbox Series X and PS5, also deliver the goods with a perfect native 4K output at 60 frames per second. It's razor sharp and runs without any issues at all. Xbox Series S then turns in a locked 1440p experience, again at 60 FPS. It basically looks identical to its bigger brother, save for the slight dip in resolution, which is also true for the Switch really, which looks exactly the same. Basically every console version I tested is sharp and stable. But there's one big caveat, and that's related to the classic mode. You see, much like the original games, the classic mode is capped to 30 frames per second. Perhaps they are slavishly following that original code base? Who can say, but either way, I found this to be a huge bummer, and is an area where it falls short compared to Open Lara, which has no such limitations. Now, it would be a little more acceptable if not for one other issue, and that's the frame pacing. You see, the 30 FPS cap simply doesn't work very well, and as a result the game looks jerky in this mode, with additional judder and misplaced frames appearing on every single console. Given this, I'd say the classic mode basically demands a patch to get it up to snuff. It's playable, but certainly not optimal. Which brings us to the PC version, which is an interesting release. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the requirements are very low, and it supports hardware dating back to 2012. I'd imagine it could even scale lower, but it seems to require a 64-bit capable CPU, which raises those requirements slightly, I suppose. However, there are a couple oddities which deserve mention here, as they can have a profound impact on the experience. Firstly, there are zero graphic options in this game, and I mean that, there's none. There is no option to change the resolution, no graphical settings to adjust, nothing. You just start it up and it goes. On paper, that sounds really bad, but in reality, it's not as large of a deal as you might have expected, simply because it targets your current desktop res and refresh rate, and due to the low requirements, you probably won't have any issues hitting that. So if you're using your monitor at 4K 120Hz, that's what you'll get in-game, and the requirements are so low, you likely won't need to adjust anything anyways. The larger issue, however, ties into how the screen is drawn. You see, when I first loaded it up, I was surprised at how jerky the visuals seem to be. If I slow the game down, you should be able to spot these stutters by eye. This is using an Nvidia card, by the way, where the stutters seem to occur pretty regularly. And if we switch over to an AMD card, you see something similar as well. This is what it looks like on the frame time graph. It's not good, but there is a way to fix it. Within the NVIDIA control panel, you need to select Preferred Layered on DXGI Swap Chain from this option. In my case, it solved this problem entirely, resulting in a completely smooth experience. But frankly, this is something the player should not have to deal with. But what about AMD and Intel users? Well, unfortunately, while there is a solution, it is somewhat less elegant. Basically, you'll need to force OpenGL triple buffering in your control panel. This cleans up most of the stutters, but not all. We still encountered minor frame rate fluctuations from time to time, these little hiccups if you will. In this case, however, I would say it's not really acceptable, as this is not a heavy game and you should get 0 stutters. All this is to say though that this is kind of a strange issue that you wouldn't typically expect. It is, thankfully, mostly fixable, specifically on NVIDIA cards, but the user shouldn't need to do this, so hopefully it can be fixed up in a future patch, since the PC version otherwise allows higher frame rates above 60 FPS. If you do get it working well, I do think it actually plays best on a keyboard even. The controls just feel right at home this way, and it's honestly how I enjoyed it the most. It might sound strange, but it gives you extreme precision over Lara's moves in a way that I didn't feel you get with a gamepad. Of course, this same PC version can also run on the Steam Deck, and thankfully the issues I just mentioned do not apply. It seems to handle swap chain management without any of the glitches or frame time interruptions, and it basically runs perfectly, even hitting a locked 90 frames per second on the OLED model. It looks awesome on Steam Deck. So if we step back and consider all the different versions, then I think it's fair to say that Tomb Raider Remastered perfectly accomplishes what it set out to deliver across the full range of consoles. It's only the PC version that has some technical issues, but if you can configure it correctly using your graphics card control panel, it then becomes the best version due to the higher frame rate. But okay, let's step back even further and discuss the games themselves. You see, this was an extremely popular series back in the 90s, but playing it today, I'm almost a little surprised that it was so widely enjoyed, given its steep challenge. Personally, after returning to Tomb Raider, I found myself fully engaged once more in its gameplay in a way that I didn't fully expect. I knew that modern games had simplified things such as jumping and climbing, but this really reminds me how much we've lost. The need to carefully line up every jump, plan your grab, and be completely aware of your surroundings is key here. Every level becomes a challenging puzzle box. Even with its abstract shapes, finding your way takes time. Slowly peeling back those layers, becoming proficient with the controls, and eventually conquering each level is remarkably satisfying. Climbing in modern games basically serves as filler between battles, but it's the focus here. And honestly, I'm not even sure that a game like this could be made in the modern era. Tomb Raider does not tell you where to go. There is no yellow paint here at all. If something looks like you can climb on it, you probably can, but it's never obvious where to go next. You'll really need to poke and prod here. If they attempted this with modern graphics, players would be instantly lost. It's this simple aesthetic specifically that allows it to work as well as it does. That said, there are still some aspects which I feel are dated. The combat, for instance, is simply not very good. In the original Tomb Raider, it's rare enough that it's not a huge issue and you can generally power through it. But with the following games, especially 2, you'll be engaging foes way more often, and the way it works isn't usually all that fun. You basically auto-target and jump around while trying to avoid damage. Enemies just rush you and continue to deal that damage, which becomes a real issue, especially when dealing with armed thugs in the second game. I also suspect the controls will prove difficult for many players. Now, I love those original tank controls. There's a precision there that feels amazing once you fully understand and accept how they work, but the controls are fundamentally different from modern games, and not everyone will enjoy that. Thankfully, there is this new control scheme available which allows full analog movement, and heck, even when using tank controls, you're still able to use the right stick to control the camera. The new controls feel similar to, say, Tomb Raider Anniversary from Crystal Dynamics, and they're largely usable despite the fact that the game is based on a grid system. If you can't deal with tank controls, definitely give them a shot. Beyond that, when you're playing with the remastered graphics, regardless of mode, The camera itself has been tweaked. It behaves differently compared to the classic graphics mode, and is generally more helpful. My suggestion though is this: start with Tomb Raider 1, work your way through it before attempting the other games. Try to learn those original tank controls and just adapt to it. Go in expecting to die, and hopefully you'll slowly begin to adapt and have a good time. Also, be sure to save often, because one other flaw here is that they didn't add any sort of checkpoint system, so it ends up working like the originals. That is, you'll need to manually save your game. This is easier on PC since you can use a quick save key, but on consoles, you'll need to bring up the menu to do it. Thankfully, you can save anytime, unlike, say, the original PlayStation game with its crystal system. And speaking of PlayStation, it was also neat going back to those older versions of the game. They're similarly playable, but the low-res graphics and warbling textures really do get in the way of understanding the level design at points, and make the games tougher than they need to be. I dealt with it back in the day, but now seeing these games again in 1080p or 4K, it really helps you understand and parse these often difficult levels. So yeah, overall I'm extremely pleased with the work done on these remasters. They're not perfect, mind you, but what's here is generally very well done, and I feel like it honors the legacy of Tomb Raider. Even things like audio, which I didn't really touch on, have been smoothed over. There's no CD audio pauses, the sound samples are much cleaner than they were in those original games, and everything just works a little bit better. They've made a real attempt to smooth out the rough edges of Tomb Raider for beginners without diluting that original experience. It is very much a product of its time, mind you, but I do think it stood the test of time in a way that genuinely surprised me. These are tough games, but they are very rewarding games as well. If you're in the mood for raiding some tombs, definitely give them a try. But that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for watching.